Back in 2019, I remember there being a significant uproar about unknown creatures roaming the forest, like Bigfoot and Skinwalkers. But this story isn't about them. It's about probably one of the scariest things I've ever heard of, the Wendigo. A few months after my friend Jacob mentioned this uproar, I went to see him since I had been away enlisted in the United States Marines. After being discharged, one of the first things I did was visit him. We were having a good time when he suggested going to a little hangout spot his now ex-girlfriend used to take him to when they wanted to escape for a few hours. I thought it was a good idea, so I grabbed my gun and we headed out to this extremely secluded area where we started messing around on an old dock that looked like it had been forgotten. It was poorly maintained and some of the boards were almost completely rotted through. About 30 minutes into our shenanigans, Jacob brought up the topic of the Wendigo. The name sounded a bit scary, even for me. Curious, I asked him about it, and he explained that if someone went into the woods and said, "Wendigo" 3 times, they would encounter the scariest creature imaginable. I decided to call his bluff and challenged him to prove it, a decision I would later regret. We began walking down a narrow path that led deep into the thick woods near the Alabama state line. After about 20 minutes, we agreed we had reached a good spot. It's worth noting that it had been raining heavily for the past few days, so the ground was completely saturated with water. Jacob dared me to say it, and I stood in silence, the forest around us almost quiet, save for the tall pines swaying in the wind above. Reluctantly, I slowly began to say it, "Wendigo, Wendigo, Wendigo." Then nothing happened. I felt a silent relief wash over me. Nothing had occurred. One thing about Jacob and me is that we loved proving each other wrong. In our 10 years of friendship, I think it was one of the first times I had succeeded. As we exchanged playful banter, a noise suddenly emerged in the distance. With the reflexes I had from the Marines, I instinctively turned toward the source of the sound, which quickly escalated into more noises. I began to move closer and soon saw a few coyotes running across the path about 30 feet in front of us. I let out another sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. I could sense that something was off. I didn't know what was wrong, but I felt it was time for Jacob and me to leave. As we turned to exit the woods, suddenly a tall pine tree began to groan and creak as it started to fall. In a moment of pure instinct, I shoved Jacob forward just as the tree crashed down through the branches and landed right between us. Jacob let out a cry of terror as the tree fell, and I jumped over it to reach him. I could feel his heart pounding as I grabbed him by his shirt and pulled him to his feet. He was still terrified, practically in tears as I urged him to move quickly. I spun him around hard, causing him to fall to his knees. I quickly helped him up, and we both began sprinting down the path in the direction we had come from. Neither of us dared to look back. I was sprinting through the woods when a familiar sound reached my ears. It was the voice of Jacob's younger sister, Olivia. He turned and tried to get past me, screaming for her. I stopped him, insisting that it wasn't her. Just then, another pine tree began to buckle. I saw it just in time to tackle Jacob to the ground as we narrowly avoided being crushed. I shouted at him to get out of there, urging him to run. As I yelled, I pulled my gun from my waistband and aimed it down the trail in the direction we had come from. Jacob reached the opening of the trail and turned back, noticing that I was still aiming my gun down the path. He urged me to hurry and get out of there. I turned and began sprinting toward him. When I reached the clearing, a good 50 feet ahead, I turned, and Jacob and I both saw it. It's the creature we had inadvertently summoned. The Wendigo stood about 9 feet tall on its hind legs. There was hardly any meat on its bones. It had spindly legs and even skinnier arms. The skin was a pale white, almost like that of a vampire. But what struck me most were its eyes. It was vibrant blue, almost like lightsaber blue for those who have seen Star Wars. Overwhelmed with fear, I raised my gun and fired at the Wendigo. Jacob, not sticking around to see if I had hit it, turned and ran toward the car. I followed suit as he passed me. That was my first encounter with this so-called Wendigo, and I pray almost every night that I never have to face something that terrifying again. I live in southern New Hampshire in a suburban area. Growing up, and even now, I lived in multiple places because of my parents' divorce. I'll start with the place I call Mom's house. Behind my mom's house were woods that we owned. Our property included about an acre of pine-dominated land, but the entire forest stretched over 20 acres. From within those woods, I could always see signs of civilization. Either the rows of suburban houses or a street on the far side that had no houses along it. These woods always felt comforting to me, like a warm presence, almost like a third parent. I loved spending time there. However, on the other side of the street was another forest, this one full of younger oak and birch trees, maybe 10 to 20 years old. One day, when I was around 9 or 10 years old, I was playing in the familiar woods behind my mom's house. Having explored all 20 acres of them, I decided it was time to check out the other forest across the street. The road was lined with woods on both sides, and further down the street was a nursing home. As soon as I entered the unfamiliar forest, my instincts told me to leave. I immediately felt as though I was being watched. Despite this unsettling sensation, my curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured deeper into the trees. I came upon a circular area where the forest seemed thinner, though it wasn't exactly a clearing. Ahead of me was a pile of trash, not anything related to drugs, but old food containers and discarded clothing. At this point, my inner voice was practically screaming at me to leave, so I turned and ran back through the woods as fast as I could until I reached the road. Once I was back in the nice woods, I felt completely fine again. A few years later, maybe 4 or 5 years after that first experience, I decided to revisit the other forest. By then, I had grown a bit bored of the woods behind my mom's house. This time, I brought a knife in a holster, just in case, and kept my hand on it the entire time. Once again, I felt like I was being watched, and that same nagging feeling to leave returned. I never found that thinner area of the forest this time, but I did stumble upon something else. Shoes. Dozens of old, decaying shoes scattered throughout the area. There were shoes of all kinds, nice shoes, small shoes, women's running shoes, baby shoes, all in varying states of decay. In addition to the shoes, I found a camping stove, an old propane canister, and food trash. I also found a camping pot, which I picked up and took home since I needed one for my own camping trips. I still have it. But it was the shoes that truly unsettled me. They were everywhere, and it didn't make sense. I pressed on and eventually came to a steep embankment, about 35 degrees, which I climbed. At the top was a residential area with a thick fence surrounding it, and none of the houses had gates. The trash and shoes were too deep in the forest to have been casually thrown there by homeowners. By then, I was thoroughly spooked, so I decided to leave. I was deeply unsettled, which was unusual for me, given that I'm usually quite stoic. However, the most frightening experience I've had happened at my dad's house, or rather, in his neighborhood. His neighborhood was tightly packed with houses and thin strips of forest, mostly huge pine trees, separated the homes. It was technically in a city, though I would occasionally see deer or even a moose, which is very rare in this area. One evening, just as dusk was falling, I was out walking my dog. It was almost fully dark, and the street lights had come on. I was nearing a turn in my usual walking route, passing by a small pine and oak forest, when I noticed something in the woods. I froze in terror. My gut twisted in the most horrible way, as though I just received the worst news of my life. I saw what looked like a deer standing on its hind legs. It had a fat, white belly and brown fur on its back, and it was staring right at me. At first, I could only see its belly. When I tried to focus on its face, I couldn't make it out. My eyesight is normally good, and I should have been able to see it, but it was as if my central vision had suddenly been switched off, leaving only my peripheral vision. The creature seemed to blend in with the forest. I could clearly see its body, but its head was impossible to make out. Then, it suddenly dropped to the ground, got on all fours, turned, and ran off toward a fence. On the other side of that fence was a dump. The patch of forest it had been standing in was only about 50 by 50 feet, and it must have jumped the 6-foot chain link fence to get in and out. Strangely, my dog, a hound with a keen sense of smell, had noticed nothing. It wasn't until the creature ran away that my dog perked up and looked in its direction. I could hear it running, and that's when I turned around and walked back home, shaken but relieved to be leaving. We had moved into our new home, deep in the woods of Tennessee about a year ago. It was meant to be a fresh start, away from the noise and bustle of civilization, where isolation promised peace. But I quickly learned that the woods had a life of their own, a constant background of crickets, tree frogs, and cicadas that filled the nights. At first, the sounds were comforting, a reminder that we were not alone, that nature thrived all around us. One evening, I went outside to retrieve something from the car. My dog, usually eager to follow me anywhere, hesitated at the door. She looked up at me with a strange unease in her eyes, as if to say she wanted no part of whatever was outside. Ignoring her reluctance, I stepped out and closed the door behind me. As soon as I left the house, I noticed the quiet. The symphony of night creatures had stopped abruptly. The absence of noise was suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling, convincing myself that the creatures had been spooked by something trivial. I walked toward the car, but as I neared it, I felt it, that undeniable sensation of being watched. I glanced around, trying to shake the paranoia, but saw nothing. Just as I opened the car door, a sudden rattle came from the hedge near the walkway. My first thought was that it was the rabbit I had seen earlier that day, until a heavy thud followed. A large rock, about the size of a cantaloupe, rolled from the direction of the hedge and landed a few feet away from me. My heart pounded as I reached for my gun, fully prepared to defend myself. I called out, warning whoever or whatever was lurking in the dark. Silence greeted me. After scanning the area and seeing no sign of movement, I reluctantly holstered the gun. I convinced myself it was a prank, probably some local kids testing the new neighbors. I turned back toward the house, but then I heard it. It was panting deep and raspy, like a large dog, but somehow wrong. Worse, it sounded like it was directly behind me. I spun around, gun drawn again, but saw nothing. The unease grew into a full-blown panic as I hurried back to the porch and slammed the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night wondering what had really happened out there, my nerves frayed. The weeks passed, and I managed to convince myself that it had been nothing more than my imagination. That was until one stormy night when my wife froze mid-conversation. She thought she heard something, a child crying for help. I hadn't heard anything, but her insistence was unsettling. She swore it sounded like our son's voice, and for a moment, she was ready to rush into the woods, even with the storm rolling in and her being 8 months pregnant. I had to practically drag her back inside, reminding her that our son was safely asleep in his bed. Still, her belief shook me. Something wasn't right, but I tried to dismiss it as stress or her own heightened nerves. A few months later, another unsettling incident occurred. My wife was standing at the open front door, staring into the dark woods. When I asked what she was doing, she told me she had heard a baby crying out there. Her certainty sent a chill down my spine. I tried to reason with her, explaining that it wasn't possible. There were no neighbors nearby, no babies to be abandoned in the woods. But she wouldn't respond, just stood there, fixated on the trees. I started to worry for her mental health. After giving birth just a month prior, I figured the isolation and exhaustion were playing tricks on her. But part of me wondered if something more was at play, something I couldn't explain. Our 3-year-old son began to act strangely as well. He'd be outside playing in front of the house, and then, without warning, he'd wander behind the shed. When I found him, he'd be pointing toward the woods, babbling excitedly about something he had seen. It was unsettling. I'd scold him for wandering off, but he'd just keep pointing, though I never saw anything out there. This wasn't the first time, and each instance left me more uneasy. It was as if something was drawing the children toward the trees. Then there were the late-night bangs. They started soon after my wife's unsettling behavior. Loud thuds would hit the walls of the house in the dead of night. I would grab my shotgun and rush outside, but I never found anything. The strangest part was that the walls being struck were 12 feet off the ground. That's too high for any normal person or animal to reach. Each time, the dogs, normally fierce barkers, would cower silently in their pen, too terrified to even whimper. The final straw came when my wife started hearing my voice when I wasn't even near her. She'd be alone in the house and suddenly hear what she swore was me, whispering her name or speaking in a low, indistinct murmur. She described it as so close, it felt like I was standing right behind her. These whispers, combined with the other incidents, began to make me question my own grasp on reality. One evening, while sighting in my rifle at the range behind the house, I heard a deep growl. It seemed to come from all around me, enveloping the woods. There was nothing in sight, yet the sound persisted, growing louder. I fired a few rounds into the target, more to scare off whatever it was than anything else. When the growling finally ceased, the woods fell into an unnatural silence, and I left, not telling my wife about the incident, unsure of what was real anymore. The most disturbing experience occurred months later, when my niece came to stay with us. She had been helping with the kids, and one night, after returning from a store run, I saw something that I could not explain. As the headlights swept over the woods, I noticed two eyes reflecting the light, too high for any animal. They glowed with a strange golden-green hue and then vanished. Later, while we were unloading the car, my dog began growling low. Her eyes locked on something across the street. I looked in the same direction and froze. There, between the trees, was something moving. At first, it was on all fours, but then it stood up. It was tall, impossibly tall, and moved with unnatural speed. Worse, it seemed to flicker in and out of view, as though it wasn't fully solid. It was like watching a shadow that refused to stay in focus. My blood ran cold. This thing, whatever it was watching us. The next morning, I measured the height where I had seen it standing. The eyes had been at least 9 feet off the ground, the space between them far too wide for any normal creature. I started researching, desperate for answers. That's when I came across stories of beings known as glimmermen, creatures that could phase in and out of visibility, communicate telepathically, and mimic voices. Everything fell into place. The panting I had heard behind me, the cries my wife swore were our sons, the baby crying outside. This thing, whatever it was, had been watching us, imitating us, trying to lure us into the woods. Now, every night, I make sure the doors are locked tight, praying we never encounter it again. My family recently bought a beautiful but overgrown piece of land in the Kootenays of British Columbia. It's a wonderful place, but my dad is frustrated by the amount of work needed to make our land comfortable for living. I personally love our little pocket of untouched nature, but I'm getting off topic. I thought it was strange that the previous owners seemed to be in a rush to sell the land, but I attributed that to the uneven ground and abundance of vegetation. My family brought their trailer to the land, and we were staying in it while I set up a small tent nearby since there wasn't enough room for me. Soon after we started staying there, my dad and I were comfortably sitting around our fire pit, stargazing and listening to the sounds of the land when we began to hear the shrieks of something that was certainly inhuman, yet unlike any animal either of us had ever encountered. It was a shrill, guttural growl, extremely drawn out and loud. My first guess was that a bear or cougar had gotten cornered, but listening more closely quickly shattered that assumption. I began to distinguish the growl of a small bear, but that wasn't the source of the strange shriek. It soon sounded like a bear was cornering something, and the threatened creature was trying to make a last-ditch escape while screaming in pain. Now, I know you're probably thinking it must have been a cougar or something similar, but I have heard a cougar in a fight before. This was not a cougar. Its shrieks and howls sounded almost demonic. Soon after the noises stopped, my dad and I decided it would be best to head to bed. While lying in my tent, I started to hear the unmistakable sound of a large creature roaming around our site. After a moment, I heard it settle into place, almost like it was sitting down and getting comfortable. I began to worry that the unidentifiable creature from earlier was stalking me until I worked up the courage to peek out of my tent's window. In the spot where I heard the creature approach, I saw not a horrifying monstrosity, but a beautiful black bear. I would normally be afraid upon seeing this. However, when I made eye contact with the bear, I felt an overwhelming sense of safety. I know this sounds crazy, but it almost felt like the bear was watching over us, protecting us from something. Soon after noticing the bear, I heard the blood-curdling screech of the unidentifiable creature, much closer now. When the bear heard this, it tensed up, rose to its feet, and began to growl menacingly. Only a moment after the bear began to growl, I heard a much larger creature than the bear run off in the opposite direction. I turned my head to see where the noise was coming from and caught a glimpse of an incredibly large deer-like animal. I didn't get a good look at it, but I remember seeing thin, skeletal, long pale arms and legs that ended with hooves. It was also covered in a dark, blood-like substance, implying that it had been injured recently. When I saw this, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't force myself to look away. I watched the trees sway and break where it was running. Then it stopped a considerable distance away from our land and let out one more shriek. The few birds that were awake in the area flew away in fear, and I shuddered. I looked back to the bear, and it was once again sitting, gazing at me with its kind, protective eyes. I have never been more grateful to have a bear living nearby, and I no longer fear them. Instead, I respect them. I had a peculiar experience in Congaree National Park, just outside of Columbia last winter, that led me to explore various online communities. The park features a stunning boardwalk winding through the swamps and cypress forests. If you could see an image of it, the story might come alive even more. I used to live in Columbia, South Carolina, and frequently visited the park, so I was quite familiar with the area. Often, I would jump the fence and stroll along the boardwalk at night. It's incredibly peaceful to wander through the swamp, surrounded by the sounds of wildlife. There were never any rangers or guards on duty after hours, so I was always alone. During my last visit in October 2021, I was taking my usual nighttime walk with a flashlight in hand. It's worth mentioning that the sounds of insects and frogs were quite loud, but suddenly everything went silent as I ventured about a mile in. I thought I heard my wife calling me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there. I was all alone and she was out of town. Then I heard the sound of water sloshing to my right, but my flashlight revealed nothing. I dismissed it as fatigue and continued walking. Shortly after, the wildlife sounds resumed, and everything seemed normal again. However, about 15 minutes later, the eerie silence returned, and I heard the water sloshing on my left side, this time more deliberate, almost as if someone were walking. I was in a dense area of cypress trees, unable to see more than 20 feet in front of me, when I heard my wife's voice again. Once again, she wasn't with me and was out of town, certainly not traversing a swamp at 1 a.m. I caught a fleeting glimpse of what appeared to be a human silhouette moving between the trees, but it looked off. It was very thin, pale, and taller than me at 6 feet. That sight pushed me to leave in a hurry. I sprinted almost 2 miles back to my truck and didn't slow down until I heard the familiar sounds of wildlife again. This boardwalk is set deep within a swamp, far from any urban area. I can't imagine anyone wandering through the water at night without a light, let alone a person or creature that size moving bipedally. I've spent my life outdoors and have never encountered an animal like that. To clarify, I wasn't under the influence or sleep deprived. I just appreciate the tranquility of the woods at night. The experience shook me enough that I turned to Reddit, diving into various stories on this and other related communities. I'm convinced I encountered a crawler or a Wendigo or some entity that can mimic voices. It's hard to believe a random person would be stumbling through the swamp, miles from civilization, sounding like my wife, but then again, this is South Carolina.